Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
Glad to be here.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a huge stack of sources today, and we're jumping right into some really heavy, highly volatile stuff.
Yeah, we are starting right in the deep end today.
We really are. We're looking at the editorial section, specifically the ongoing joint military operations by the U.S. and Israel against Iran.
Right, the conflict they're calling Operation Epic Fury.
Exactly. It started on February 28th, 2026, and the sheer scale is just staggering. I mean, we are talking about a colossal civilian cost here. Plus, the assassination of senior Iranian leaders, including Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and their national security chief, Ali Larijani.
Yeah, and before we go any further into the mechanics of this operation, I need to explicitly state to you, the listener, that the sources we are unpacking contain highly charged geopolitical events.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints here, left-wing or right-wing. We are not taking any sides. We are simply reporting the analysis and the facts presented in the article impartially, just so you can understand the underlying dynamics of what is actually happening on the ground.
Right, just laying out the facts. And what the sources show is that Israel and the U.S. seem to approach this with a massive strategy of saturation bombardment.
Yeah, basically expecting the Iranian state to just immediately collapse under all that pressure.
Which didn't happen. It's like they're in a situation comparable to poking a spider's web, expecting to clear it out with one swift motion, but instead they're just getting dangerously tangled in it.
That is a very accurate analogy. Iran hasn't collapsed at all.
Not even close, right? Their uranium stockpile is still totally secure deep underground. And now they're threatening severe retaliation, specifically a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is huge.
It's massive. That's a choke point for nearly 30% of the world's oil shipments.
And that expected quick collapse turning into this grueling war of attrition is exactly why this matters so much for the long-term global picture. We are already seeing the systemic cracks.
You mean like war fatigue?
Exactly. Within the U.S., particularly in the Navy, severe signs of war weariness are setting in. I mean, the supply chain mechanics for high-tech weapons just aren't designed for endless bombardment.
Right, you can't just mass-produce these things overnight.
No, you can't. The cost and the time required to replenish systems like Patriot missiles and Hadid interceptors are astronomical. And Israel's strategy to prompt a regime collapse via air power simply hasn't materialized.
Because air power alone rarely dismantles deeply entrenched state infrastructure, right?
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most profound miscalculation here might actually be cultural and religious, not just military.
Wait, really? Because usually if an administration is hit with overwhelming military force and its top leadership is assassinated, that shatters the chain of command. Why is Iran's administration surviving this? Is that a cultural element they missed?
There is a massive cultural blind spot at play here. By attempting to overthrow a Shiite regime through outside force, they aren't just engaging in standard geopolitics.
What are they doing then?
They are striking directly at the historical memory of the Battle of Karbala.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In Shiite political culture, that 7th century battle isn't just history. It symbolizes the ultimate civilizational resistance against overwhelming odds. It emphasizes patience, sacrifice, and strategic endurance.
So killing Ali Khamenei didn't end the fervor or create a vacuum that led to surrender?
Not at all. Instead, the appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader is triggering this fierce, galvanized revival of Shiite resistance.
So the external pressure is actually enhancing their militancy rather than forcing submission.
Exactly. The transnational and religious aspects are stronger now.
They assumed military shock and awe would override centuries of ingrained cultural resilience. That is a profound misread of the landscape, leading to a massive human-made disaster abroad.
It really is.
Well, sticking with today's editorial section, I want to pivot from the governance of human-made disasters to how we are managing natural disasters right here at home.
Because there is a startling governance failure happening there, too.
Yeah, specifically with the 16th Finance Commission's disaster funding formula.
This perfectly illustrates our theme today. It is a textbook example of how mathematical formulas, when applied without ground-level context, create completely absurd realities.
Totally. Let's look at the state of Odisha. I mean, it has a nearly 575-kilometer coastline and absorbs some of the most powerful cyclones on the subcontinent.
Right.
And over 2 decades, they've invested heavily in early warning systems, built concrete shelters, and essentially brought cyclone mortality down to near zero.
Which is an incredible achievement.
It is, and their reward for this competence. Under the 16th Finance Commission, Odisha is receiving the single largest reduction in disaster funding share among all 28 states.
Yeah, a 1.57 percentage point drop.
How does the state with the highest hazard score in the country lose the most funding?
Because the math is entirely blind to geography. It comes down to a structural flaw in the Commission's multi-layered disaster risk index.
Okay, break that down for us.
The formula they used dictates that risk equals hazard multiplied by exposure multiplied by vulnerability.
Which, in theory, sounds logical.
In a vacuum, sure. A cyclone hitting an empty beach is a hazard, but it isn't a disaster because nothing is exposed. The problem is how they measure these variables.
Right.
For the exposure metric, the Commission simply uses a state's total population. They don't use the population actually living in the hazard zone.
Wait, are you telling me a massive inland state gets a higher exposure score for coastal cyclones just because it has more people overall?
That is the grim reality of the math. Uttar Pradesh gets the maximum exposure score of 25 simply due to its massive population size.
That makes zero sense.
I know. Odisha's hazard score is the highest in the country at 12, but its total population score is only 5. So its overall risk index is mathematically overshadowed by states like Bihar and UP.
States that have much lower hazard scores but massive total populations.
Exactly. And then it gets even worse with the vulnerability metric.
How so?
The formula measures a state's vulnerability by taking its per capita income and inverting it. So the baseline assumption is that poorer states are inherently more vulnerable to disasters.
But that completely ignores the reality of infrastructure. That math aggressively punishes a wealthier but highly exposed state like Kerala.
Yes, it does.
I mean, they suffered their worst flooding in a century in 2018. It caused 31,000 crore rupees in damage. Yet they get a rock-bottom vulnerability score just because their average income happens to be higher.
Right.
It's like offering premium state-subsidized flood insurance to a city on top of a mountain just because it's crowded, while completely denying it to a small coastal town that's currently underwater.
That is a perfect way to describe it. By relying on total headcount instead of exposed population and average income instead of actual infrastructure vulnerability, 20 states have lost their relative share of disaster funding.
They haven't magically become safer, they're just smaller or wealthier.
Exactly. It is a complete failure of risk governance.
And this structural blindness in how we govern risk on the ground translates perfectly into today's science section. Because we are making the exact same kind of regulatory miscalculation high above us in space.
Yeah, the sheer volume of traffic in Earth's orbit right now is just, it's creating an ethical and logistical nightmare.
The orbital environment is becoming increasingly crowded and fragile. But from what I understand, this is less of an engineering problem and much more a failure of international regulation.
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at a classic ethical vacuum.
Because tracking orbital debris is nearly impossible until a collision actually happens.
Yeah.
And we have all these private actors launching massive satellite constellations.
Right.
But the regulations governing them are anchored in the Outer Space Treaty. And Articles 6 and 7 of that treaty were written in the 1960s.
Yeah, for an era when only a handful of nation-states even went to space.
Exactly. It is entirely unequipped to handle cumulative collective harm. I mean, if a coin-sized piece of debris traveling at 17,000 miles per hour can instantly destroy a multi-million-dollar active satellite, why are operators allowed to just forum shop for whichever country has the most permissive launch regulations?
What's fascinating here is the concept of an absent international duty of care. Right now, there is no global ethical threshold for what constitutes acceptable orbital congestion.
So anyone can just launch whatever they want.
Pretty much. National regulators rely almost entirely on what companies promise they will do before a launch, like promising they have enough fuel to deorbit a dead satellite in 5 years.
But there's no follow-up.
No, there is very little actual post-launch verification.
That's crazy. It's like allowing companies to dump toxic waste into a river, but the river is moving at breakneck speed above our heads, and the regulators are just trusting a pinky promise from the polluters that they'll clean it up eventually.
That is a very apt way to look at it, because it's an honor system. The responsible operators who actually spend the engineering time and money to mitigate debris absorb higher costs.
Well, the reckless operators just register their launches in countries with looser rules.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But here is where it gets highly relevant for India's immediate future. As India's commercial space sector aggressively expands, the government is developing its own comprehensive national space legislation.
Right.
And this gives them a unique opportunity. India can embed enforceable orbital responsibility directly into its law.
So they could actually mandate the cleanup.
Yes,
Yes.
legally mandating verifiable end-of-life disposal strategies and explicitly refusing to let operators simply abandon their hardware once it stops making money.
That's huge. It's about taking the principles of environmental law, like intergenerational equity, and applying them to the stars. We really have to govern the space above our world better than we govern the resources on it.
We really do.
Well, that idea of unseen pressures compounding until a system breaks brings us perfectly into today's text and context section. Let's pull this conversation back down to earth, specifically to the Indian economy.
Let's do it.
Because those geopolitical shocks we discussed earlier in the Middle East, the ones impacting the Strait of Hormuz, they are slamming directly into our domestic reality.
They really are. They're acting as a massive stress test, and they are exposing a glaring macroeconomic contradiction in India's fiscal resilience.
Because if you just look at the headline numbers, things look fantastic. I mean, the Q3 FY26 GDP growth is projected at a robust 8.1%.
Right, and public capital expenditures up.
Yeah, but the ground reality for the average citizen is severe stress. The rupee has depreciated to a record low of 95 to the dollar, and the Indian basket of crude oil just hit a staggering $156.29 per barrel.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of India's fiscal architecture, you see why a high GDP number doesn't protect the government's wallet. India's revenue buoyancy has structurally shifted.
Let's break that down. Revenue buoyancy. Essentially, you mean how easily the government's tax income grows when the broader economy grows, right?
Yes. In a balanced system, as people get wealthier, income tax collections rise steadily. But India's tax base is now overly reliant on transaction-linked taxes, primarily the GST, rather than a deepening of the direct income tax base.
So the government makes the bulk of its money when people are actively buying and selling goods.
Exactly. Not necessarily from a stable, growing base of salaried workers.
And that's where the $156 barrel of oil breaks the system.
Yes. Step by step, here's the mechanism of that squeeze. India imports around 85 to 87% of its crude oil. When global oil prices spike, domestic transport and logistics costs skyrocket.
Everything just gets more expensive to move.
Right, and that inflation instantly compresses household spending. When households stop buying non-essential goods, the sheer volume of economic transactions drops.
And because the government relies so heavily on transaction taxes, GST collections immediately fall.
Exactly, and simultaneously, the government's expenditure shoots up because they have to pay vastly more to subsidize essential imports like fertilizer and LPG cylinders. Revenues plummet exactly when expenses explode.
Wow. So what does this all mean for you and me? It means individual households are acting as the shock absorbers for this national volatility.
They absolutely are.
I mean, the data shows household liabilities have risen to an alarming 41% of GDP. People aren't consuming more because they are earning more. They are sustaining their basic consumption through credit and debt.
Yeah, it's a debt-fueled survival.
And you see the visceral human cost of this energy shock in the informal sector. Look at gig delivery workers right now. The sources note they are facing a 50 to 60% drop in daily orders.
Which is devastating.
It is. And why? Because the severe disruptions in the LPG supply chain mean restaurants and cloud kitchens literally cannot get the commercial gas cylinders they need to cook the food. The macro shock halts the microeconomy.
Meanwhile, the state is focusing its expenditure heavily on massive infrastructure and capital formation, building roads and ports.
Which is structurally good for long-term growth, sure.
Yes, but it leaves virtually no fiscal room to support the labor-intensive sectors and the basic welfare stabilizers that regular people rely on when these external shocks hit.
It's a really jarring disconnect between the strong official economic growth numbers celebrated in the headlines and the agonizing debt-fueled reality for households on the ground.
It really is.
And continuing in the text and context section, this disconnect between what the state records as success and what the citizens experience as survival isn't new. It heavily echoes the ultimate systemic disconnect we saw exactly 6 years ago.
Right, you're referring to the unofficial reckoning of the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown.
Yes. We are looking at an analysis based on 3 deeply revealing books covering this period: Till We Win, The Great Shutdown, and Faith and Fury.
Because while other countries held formal, state-sponsored inquiries into their pandemic responses to learn from their mistakes, India largely hasn't.
No, they haven't. So these books serve as our vital historical record, and they document an absolute failure of logistics that wasn't just an accidental side effect, but a defining feature of the policy itself.
Yeah.
Like the snapping of the entire railway network with just 4 hours' notice, it left millions of migrant workers stranded overnight.
We all remember those horrifying images of people walking hundreds of kilometers.
Exactly. But the medical data is just as stark. During the absolute peak of the second wave, ICU and ventilator capacity across the country actually dropped by 30 to 46%.
The mechanics of that capacity drop are terrifying. It wasn't just a lack of new machines. The existing supply chains for oxygen, spare parts, and specialized medical staff completely fragmented under the uncoordinated state-by-state lockdowns.
Just a total collapse of the system.
Yes, but it is the human stories that anchor those sterile statistics. The sources highlight Jyoti Kumari, the young girl who cycled 1,200 kilometers with her injured father on the back of her bike during the lockdown.
That story was everywhere.
Right, and it is frequently framed as an incredible story of Indian endurance. But at its core, it's fundamentally a story of an entirely absent state support system.
Yeah.
And what ties all these retrospective accounts together is the central pervasive problem of counting.
Or rather, the state's refusal to count what it doesn't wish to acknowledge.
Exactly. If you look at the 2025 data finally released by the Office of the Registrar General, it confirmed that there were 1.02 crore registered deaths in 2021.
Wow.
That is a massive 25.9% increase in mortality from the previous year.
And that data deeply contrasts with the official state tallies promoted during the crisis. The books detail how independent reporters went directly to local cremation grounds and found manual registers documenting over 100 cremations on days the state officially claimed there were only 14 COVID deaths.
It's just staggering.
And those same reporters fighting to get the truth weren't even counted as frontline workers, despite the fact that some 500 of them died trying to get us this information. But perhaps the most jarring takeaway from this retrospective isn't the data itself, it's the political fallout, or rather, the complete lack of it.
This raises an incredibly important sociological question about how large populations process collective trauma.
Right.
The pandemic, despite the massive death toll and economic ruin, never became a major defining poll issue in subsequent elections. According to the analysis in Faith and Fury, in the vast rural hinterlands, the devastation was widely viewed and internalized as an act of divine intervention.
Wait, really? A natural, unavoidable calamity?
Yes.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanism behind that mindset. When the state machinery, like reliable hospitals, social safety nets, crisis management, when that is completely invisible in your daily life to begin with, its absence during a massive crisis doesn't register as a policy failure.
Exactly. It just feels like an act of God.
You can't blame a government for failing to provide an ICU bed if your village never had a functioning hospital in the first place.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play. The baseline expectation of state support was so low that the systemic failure wasn't penalized at the ballot box.
It leaves you with a very heavy question to mull over. If history is written only by the data a state chooses to count, and if catastrophic systemic failures are just accepted as unavoidable acts of fate by the public, how many of our future crises will simply go unrecorded and uncorrected? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.